Oh, hi, Mr. Kuhn. Now that we've given our students the basics of how to write an FRQ, I thought it would be helpful if you could give an example. I know that we have an example of an MHS student who scored a 5 in 2012. So if you could walk us through that and what you as a reader saw that was effective, what they did, they must have done several things effectively to earn a 5.
All right, thanks, Ms. Bonadies, and welcome here to part 2 of the Kuhn Bonadies Academy here and how to do an FRQ. All right, so we have a question here from 2012, all right, and this dealt with minority voting rights, okay? So this is what we call a stimulus-based question, all right? So here you see a graph with minority representation in Congress from 1960, all right, to 2010, all right? And then you see that these lines are the African Americans, Hispanics, African American in House membership, and African American or Hispanic percentage of House memberships. All right, so this question says, using the chart above, all right, compare minority representation in 1960 to 2010. So this is a compare question. All right, so what we're going to do is we're simply comparing 1960 to 2010. All right, so our verb there is compare. All right. Then we're going to explain how each of the following assisted in the removal of barriers to minority voting. All right, so it's explain how each, and it's an explain question, so we're closing the loop. All right, so we're going to make sure we use our therefore in that question. All right, and then part C, we're going to identify one barrier that currently impedes minority representation in Congress. So we're going to identify. Remember, identify can just be a bullet point. All right, and then explain why the barrier you identified inhibits minority representation in Congress. So 2 parts to part C. All right. Now, another thing you're going to want to do when you get to FRQs is you're going to want to try to guess what the rubric looks like. Okay, not so much what's on it, but how many points there are. So for part A, we're going to have 1 point. We're doing the comparison. We get it right, we get 1 point. In part B, where we explain how each of the following assisted, all right, there's 2 things, so that's going to be worth 2 points. And then C, we're going to identify a barrier and then explain why that barrier inhibits minority representation. That's another 2 points. So this is a 5-point rubric, all right? That's another difference with Gov versus History. History has a set rubric for every question. This one has a specific rubric for every question. It changes based on the type of question. So this one's worth 5 points. So you want to try to get all 5 of the points, but from past experience, I can tell you if you can score a 2 or 3 on this, you're going to be ahead of the national average, okay, moving forward. All right? So let's see what this student wrote, all right, in answering this question. All right? So he identified one barrier that impeded minority, for part A was using a chart above, compare. All right? So you see he says in 1960, minority representation for African Americans and Hispanics was near 0.1%. Then, so there's his comparison. And in 2010, minority representation was 9.7 in Hispanics. So all he did was repeat the question, restated the graph, all right, took the information right out of the chart. He's got his point, all right? So 1 point down, moving forward. So I got to keep erasing as we go through here on the smart board. All right, now part B, all right, we're explaining how these, give you 2 things to pick from, explain how each of the following assisted in the removal of barriers to minority voting, okay? So first he starts with the Voting Rights Act. Now you see he labeled the B, all right, like we want you to label. Separate paragraph, he skipped a line, okay? Now, we don't, what we want you to do is maybe even make this B1, all right, so you make it even easier for the reader, all right? So Voting Rights Act, he underlined it, make it really obvious for the reader to see. Voting Rights Act of 1965 allowed more minorities to vote. So he's kind of defined what it was. But the question wasn't defined, it was explained. But he had to state what it did first. This is because the act prohibited with literacy tests. All right. So there's 1 point. It prohibited literacy tests. So he said what it is. But still, if it was defined or identified, he's got his point. He still has to go further. The prohibition of literacy tests and other unfair voting tests used to prohibit minorities from voting, there's the language from the question, all right, prohibit minorities from voting, allowed for more minorities to vote. Also, the abolition of the grandfather clause under the act, That's not quite true, but we won't worry about that. That's a key point, though, is you can be wrong, all right, but not lose a point. As long as the right answer is there, your wrong answer can be contradicted.
Yes, I was going to say that too. That's a great point, that you can, in fact, put something untrue and not lose a point. What you cannot do is write something that's mutually exclusive. You can't say, for example, federalism is a division of power and between a state and national government, and federalism is the combination of power, or federalism is only power in one government.
Right, and obviously don't contradict yourself either. So don't say that the Voting Rights Act got rid of literacy tests and the Voting Rights Act added literacy tests. That wouldn't work either. But if you said, like you said here, that it got rid of literacy tests and grandfather clauses, he still gets his point. All right? And then finally, all right, so he says, under the act allowed for minorities to vote more, and therefore, there's your key, therefore, more representation in Congress. He's gone back to the question, all right, going back to the question that says, how to assist in the removal of barriers to minority voting. So by increasing minority representation, he's closed the loop on that one. All right. Now we're coming here to Ms. Bonadies' favorite amendment, amendment number 24, which we know.
The 24th Amendment eliminated poll taxes.
We'll give you a mnemonic device in class that's off camera here. All right.
It's a great one.
All right. So 24th Amendment. So this would be his B2. All right. 24th Amendment prohibited the poll tax. He's identified it. We're good so far. The prohibition of the poll tax allowed for more minorities to vote because minorities could vote without paying the fee. The abolition of the poll tax reduced the cost of voting, therefore increasing, there's therefore again, therefore increasing minority voter turnout because the minorities would not want to spend their money on a tax. So there's got to be a link there between the payment of the money and that minorities were prohibited because of this. Okay?
And with that, therefore, he's continuously closing the loop.
Always bring your therefore in to close the loop. And we want to make sure you're labeling these as well. And we will know when we grade these FRQs who watched the video or not, because if you just write this as one big paragraph, we'll know you didn't watch. All right? Word to the wise. All right. Part C. All right? Part C, sorry to go so fast here, is identify a barrier that currently impedes minority representation, 1 point, and explain why that inhibits minority representation in Congress. All right? So he says one barrier that prevents minority representation in Congress is gerrymandering. There's 1 point. In this process, congressional districts are redrawn to favor the majority party. So he's defined gerrymandering. Still not there yet, though. All right? These redrawn districts can dilute the voting strength of minorities. All right, there's his explanation. He dilutes the voting strength of minorities, preventing minority representation. There's his use of the question, all right, that inhibits minority representation. He said preventing minority representation. Same thing. In gerrymandering, minority populated areas can be split, therefore reducing the voting strength of minorities and minority representation. So this student would have earned a 5. All right, it was a perfect free response. Okay, and obviously that helped him get a 5 on the exam.
And he did such a great job, but obviously even if he hadn't, he did get the 5. But for this one, for C, he identified, even if he identified, but he couldn't quite explain, which he did, why, he still got that point. So you want to just get everything you can get. So identify, and then again, he did close the loop with the explain. But even had he not explained it, he would have still gotten that identify point.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Bonadies. All right, we're going to wrap up here with just looking at the rubric for that question. So as I told you, I've been a reader since 2006, and I've been doing U.S. history the last couple of years, but I scored this exact question. In fact, I scored that exact essay. So this is the rubric that the College Board publishes, and then you can kind of see my chicken scratch on here, which is just the notes I make as a reader to sort of show that. We can talk more about that in class. But basically, there's your 1 point for A, all right, demonstrating an increase in minority representation. All right, all you have to show is that it went up. You literally, for this question, since it was an identify or it was a compare, you could have said it increased from 1960 to 2010, and you would have got the point. But you want to say it because we don't want to use pronouns, but it increased would have worked on that one. All right, then in B, all right, they give you all of the options of things you can talk about, okay? Sorry for these lines all over the place. We don't want the keyboard there. All right. All right. So for B, you could say eliminating voter registration requirements, i.e., literacy test. Could have said federal oversight of elections. That's now declared unconstitutional. We'll talk about that later. And eliminating English-only ballots. So any one of these would have worked. Probably about 99% of kids went with the literacy test option. But when the College Board makes the rubric, they put all possibilities. So as long as you have one of these, you're going to get that point. And then for poll taxes, they were a little more particular on this one, all right? Because for the elimination of poll taxes, all right, which had limited voting among the poor, all right? So you have to make a connection here between poor and minorities, all right? So look at the way they worded this. Led to an increase in minority voting because minorities are often overrepresented among the poor, okay? So you can't just say poor minorities or just the poor, just minorities. You had to kind of link that together somehow, all right, based on the statistics and things, all right? And then finally, here's C, all right? And they give you basically two categories. So you could talk about what's limited minority candidates or what's limited minority voters, all right? And they have a whole laundry list of things, all right? Incumbency advantage, gerrymandering, majority minority districts, prejudice, electoral resources, electoral disqualifications, single member districts, winner take all. That's our election system, all right? And then what barriers to minority voting would be ID requirements, English only ballots, the fact that felons can't vote, purging of voter rolls. You'll see that in a movie called Recount after the AP exam. And then voter intimidation. That's where you could bring like the Klan and stuff like that into that one if you wanted to. Okay? So those would be your identify points. And to get the explain, notice they say must explain the barrier identified that it limits minority representation. All right? Minority voter must explain how the barrier limits minority participation in Congress. All right? So thanks for watching this episode of the Kuhn Bonadies Academy.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in class tomorrow.
And we're building responsible voters one video at a time.